It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the Coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day listeners, and welcome once again to the Two Jacks, going all the way around the world. But we're starting in Australia today because there's big things going on. And joining me, as usual, is Hong Kong Jack. G'day, mate. How are you?
I'm excellent, mate. Just two things before we start. These are matters arising out of the minutes of the last
Minutes
meeting.
arising, right? Matters arising, yes.
First is for Farmer Lawrence. Whatever the merits of your argument, Lawrence, the Dutch population have voted in a regional election, and the biggest single party is going to be the Farmers Group. And these regional elections will determine the makeup of the Dutch Senate. I didn't know they had a Senate, to be quite honest. So it seems that the getting rid of the nitrogen out of the fertiliser campaign has not resonated all that well with the population of the Netherlands.
Yes, and of course you're referring there to a letter from Lawrence where he talked about these matters becoming very, very serious for the Dutch population in terms of their drinking water. But also, Jack, it would seem that here we have a political group that actually is for the farmers, because the National Party here they've been given a bugger about the farmers for a very long time. No, they're all into the miners.
They've been agrarian socialists forever. The other bit is we were talking about the boat arrivals on the coast of the United Kingdom, and we were arguing about how many of them were Afghanis. The people from Afghanistan make up the second biggest group. But that makes them 18% of the total for the year. And the more important figure in all of that data, that was from the BBC, and I'd recommend that, Jack. Don't trust the human rights organisations. They are just barrackers. Mm-hmm. Most important figure is that the approval rate for applications for asylum in the UK is about 64%. In France, it's 25%, and Germany about 45%. And I suspect, although I haven't been able to find this figure, that the approval rate for people who arrive by boat, that is unauthorised arrivals, because they will arrive without papers, I suspect the approval rate for them will be like it was in Australia, which will be 95%. And that is the sugar on the table.
Well, the sugar on the table, Jack, I've just got to remind you that I had a bit of a look at some of these figures myself, and I did, yes, note that the Afghan unscheduled arrivals in the UK were second on the list after, I think, the Albanians, was the number one. The
Albanians are easily the biggest number.
Yes, but I also noticed that in terms of unscheduled arrivals, France, 436,000, UK 89,000.
Yeah.
So if there's sugar on the table, it's in France, isn't it?
No, the difference is that the French send them back. The people who are a bit smarter say, I want to get to England where I won't get sent back.
Okay, all right. Okay, well, of course, I totally lied about us starting with Australia because Jack's just dragged us off into the UK and to Europe. But we have a state election this week. I haven't trundled off to the polls. I will be voting early, possibly this afternoon, or definitely Thursday, because I don't like queuing, Jack.
I'm a firm believer that we all should vote on the same day.
Rubbish, Jack. Absolutely rubbish. You people with disabilities. There are all sorts of people who just don't need to stand in great long queues, winding around dismal school playgrounds, and people flogging bloody unknown pieces of meat in unidentifiable pieces of meat in pieces of bread. I don't go for it.
It's all part of the fun.
Yeah, well, anyway, so there's been early voting's been on for a little while here. Now the bookies have scheduled bookies have set their mark at $1.15 for a Labor win. Now that is the party to form government. Labor is a $1.15, and I think Sportsbet's got the coalition at $6. So very, very short favourite is Chris Minns and Labor, and that's because, Jack, they are more likely to form a form of government, whether it's majority or minority.
Yes. That's the distinction with the betting odds that have been put up. As far as I can tell, the Liberals are not going to be able to get a majority, or that's unlikely.
Very unlikely.
And it's fairly unlikely that Labor will either, but they probably will be able to form a government.
Well, there are three Greens in the lower house, so you'd expect them to support Labor. But what might muddy the waters a little bit, Jack, is that we've got probably, I'd say at least 2 seats going to what we might loosely call the teal independence groups from the coalition, which might just make it a little bit more difficult for Labor to form government. But it looks like a little bit of a recasting of the federal election last year, where the coalition, the Liberals in particular, in some of their blue ribbons might lose them.
I saw a photo of our friend. You and I were the foundation members of the Elizabeth Farrelly fan club.
We were.
We used to enjoy her Thursday columns.
Yes,
there was always the challenge of working out just what she was talking about.
She's having a crack.
She's having a crack, and she looked to be in a kind of a teal coloured poster I saw. Is she a teal?
Well, it's not really teals as it was last year. So there's this sort of loose band of independents who, I don't know that we'd cast anybody as belonging to the same ideology as Elizabeth Farrelly, whatever.
Well, how could you work out what it was?
Whatever that is, yeah. Yes, that is probably the coalition's greatest threat, that they face these progressive thinking, shall we say, thinking independents in Liberal safe seats, and they will lose a couple of them, I would say, minimum.
Yeah.
So
I think there is one difference between this state election and the last federal election, is that Dominic Perrottet is not on the nose in the way that Scott Morrison was.
I think that's absolutely right, but at the core of it is 12 years of government. And,
yeah, that's right.
And that's not necessarily a reflection on Perrottet's capacity as a premier. There've been some balls ups, as you'd expect in any government that's been around for 12 years. They bought trains that don't fit in tunnels, and all sorts of balls ups have occurred. But generally speaking, I think there's not the actual tangible loathing of Perrottet that there was for Morrison.
No.
And I think there is that sense that it will be, that just time's up. The use by date
I think
has flicked past.
Yeah, that's right. But there is that difference. Yeah.
So, where does that leave the Liberal Party, Jack? I mean, we know it leaves them without any representation in government on the mainland. Where do they come back from that, Jack?
Well, they have to do what Labor Party said, what both parties have had to do from time to time, and just knuckle down and start again.
The next challenge is some way off, and that's the Queensland election. They're on fixed terms now. That's the Queensland state election. It's still some way off, so it'll leave them for almost 2 years without any holding any position of government anywhere in any state or territory on the mainland of Australia. That will be devastating for their membership. It will be devastating for their fundraising, and I suspect they're in for a fairly rough ride.
And it also means the loss of the resources that being in government gives you.
Oh, that's right. it's a nightmare. I do remember Joe Hockey after the 2013 election and the first sitting of the House with the new Abbott government in place, and Labor were being a bit uproarious from the opposition benches, and Joe Hockey said, and I don't often quote Joe Hockey, but this wasn't a bad one. He goes, "This is the best day you'll have in opposition. Everything gets worse after that," and that's about right. So what does Chris Minns have to do, Jack, to lock up that crossbench?
Well, who was it? Someone was quoting John Della Bosca gave some advice to Bob Carr when he was facing a similar election where they weren't sure whether they would get the majority and they were going to be relying on independents. And Della rang Bob Carr a couple of days before the election. He says, "Ring every independent and wish them well."
Mm-hmm. You think Minns might do the same? He'd be well advised to do the same, wouldn't he? Every single one of them, particularly those teals who aren't quite teals, standing in Liberal seats, which they might, a number, I'm predicting 2 minimum, and it might be worse than that. Meanwhile, Jack, around the country, the Jack Elliott Award might be being handed over to Bruce Lehrmann. And just to explain to listeners who may be on listening to us for the first time, the Jack Elliott Award is someone who narrowly escapes a catastrophe only to call in the solicitors and have another crack in the civil courts. And as we all found out with Jack Elliott, he ended up broke and watching his undies and socks going around the laundromat in Carlton on Wednesday night. So, is Bruce Lehrmann headed down the same path, Jack?
Well, he certainly seems to be. He's applied to the court for an extension of time in which to issue the writs for a defamation action against various people.
Because it must technically be lodged within a year, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Or given leave by the court to do so.
So in doing that, he's put in play the circumstances in which he chose not to issue the defamation writ while the criminal case was still going on. And that's allowed his opponents in court to run out a series of texts that he sent at the time. Now, I'm not going to say that he was looking for marching powder, but he was saying he needed bags. Let's get it done. No one has to work tomorrow. And that his friend was paying, so let's get lit.
Let's get lit. You got any gear?
Any gear and
fishing gear,
et
fishing equipment. What would that mean? Do you think, Jack?
Well, I've spent a lot of time around friends from the financial services and investment banking industries, and they seem to specialise in this sort
gear?
of thing.
Like a bit of gear.
It sounds like he might have a sniffle going on.
Yes, indeed. So that's just the very early stages of potential embarrassment for him.
It's only going to get worse from here, Bruce. I can tell you.
All right. Look, we talked about this briefly as much. We didn't have the detail, but the subs deal was more or less in place when we last went to record last week early. And since then, that deal has been announced. Australia will be an industrial military complex, an overwhelming military force, of course, and invading nations should take note that we will fight back hard, provided they do it about 2042. Other than that, please leave us alone. But the subs deal met with the ire. Look, there was almost universal support for it. I'm going to have a bit of a chat about why it's important shortly. But it was all sort of derailed when Paul Keating came along, had a chat in the National Press Club, and it was a remote sort of chat, wasn't it? And was very mean towards some journalists, Jack.
Yes, I did find that rather amusing.
It was pretty funny, wasn't it?
And some of them were scurrying around like year six boys and girls saying, teacher, Paul was mean to me,
I just want to talk to you about a friend of mine who watched it. He said, "Did you see Keating at the press club today? It was a truly glorious spray at everything and everyone, AUKUS, plus the cannon fodder reporters Sky, SMH, ABC and others sent to question the great man. He left them all bruised, bloody, dribbling messes. It was hilarious seeing smug Herald and Sky children, barely out of uni, obviously thinking they were the chosen ones, and this old boomer would be easy pickings." He said, "It was like the Somme, the best and brightest marching into a swathe of machine gun fire, Keating only pausing occasionally to reload."
Yeah, it did look a bit like that, didn't it?
It did look a little bit like that. Anyway, journalist defence notwithstanding, is it a good move, Jack? Is this AUKUS subs deal comes with cruise missiles? We just bought a bunch of them as well that will be loaded into the subs and elsewhere, and and marine assets. Is it a good idea?
Look, I think there are good arguments for and against it, to be honest.
Right.
I think we need to have a useful deterrence, and we need to be able to project our power for a fair way off the coast. Whether this is the right solution, I think, is arguable. I mean, Paul Keating made some good points, and I don't think there's an absolute black and white, this is the best thing ever or this is the worst thing ever result. I think it's a question of judgment.
I did notice also that Malcolm Turnbull described it as a potential disaster. I don't think that's not a direct quote, but something along those lines.
That's because it doesn't agree with what he decided.
fair point. But look, he is number 2 on the podcast list, Jack, so we should be respectful. The thing that I think has been missed by a lot of the sort of armchair military strategists, of which I am one, by the way, is that the capacity of submarines is designed to keep your shipping lines open. It's not necessarily designed as a first strike weapon, although it certainly has that capability, but it's designed to, in the event of a conflict, prevent a sort of naval blockade of the country that would basically starve us. Well, not starve us, but would keep a lot of our imports away from us. We can feed ourselves, of course, but that is one of the strategic elements of having the submarines.
The other part of it is that there is a deterrence element to it. You know, that if you take action against a country, that country has some capacity to hurt you back.
Yeah, exactly right. And you and I were having a chat about this yesterday, and we were looking at the Singapore armed forces and their capacity. Now, Singapore is a non-aligned country. I believe that's right, Jack?
Yeah, I think that's correct, yeah. It's not in any formal alliances with anybody, I don't think.
I think ASEAN, but I don't think that's not a treaty organisation.
Yeah.
No, and so it buys its gear from the United States, from Israel, from Germany, from France. It has a very strong military capability, pound for pound, shall we say. Relatively small population relative to Southeast Asia, and very small landmass. But it has taken care of its military capabilities. No one in their right minds would say that Singapore was defendable against an overwhelming force. But what they've established is if you want to try it, you're going to end up with a pretty bloody nose.
Yes.
And so buying these things off the shelf, Jack, makes quite a lot of sense, doesn't it?
Yes, I think it was the Indonesian President Habibie who wanted to, he had a background as an aircraft engineer. He wanted to design and build Indonesian passenger aircraft. And I always thought of that when we were getting the Collins-class subs, because the complexity of building a diesel-electric submarine is much higher than building a new 777.
Yes.
And I could never work out why we were doing that, why we just didn't buy them from somebody else, as they were. And I understand they want to do employment in South Australia, but
Legal concern, yes.
yeah, these things are just too complex to build 6 of them. You've got to be. If you're going to spend all that money on designing and developing them, you've got to, build 150 of them. It's a bit like Boeing jets.
And of course, when they were built, Jack, it was, the stealth capacity was somewhat diminished. It was like someone was playing AC/DC full blast as the submarine was coming in.
They ended up being very successful, but at great cost and for a long time.
Yeah. But of course,
one of the things that they were very, very good at, and that's another thing that submarines do, is that they enable you to sit off somebody's coast and listen to encrypted conversations, etc. And I am told that in the when East Timor was in crisis, that a Collins-class sub was sitting in Indonesia somewhere, and they were able to listen to everything.
Well, they did have the place bugged as well, Jack. When we know that now in Lexi Downer's time. Look, of course, the nuclear subs, fast manoeuvrable, in, strike, out fast. That's what they're designed for. There's only a certain number of countries you can buy nuclear subs from, Jack. I wouldn't be buying the Russian ones because some of them end up on the bottom of the sea. It's the Americans.
We could have bought
Brits
nuclear
or the
subs
French.
from France, of course.
Yes.
What we were proposing to buy from France was a nuclear sub that was turned back into a diesel electric submarine.
That's right. And I think
that was Malcolm's brilliant idea.
Yeah, that was Malcolm's brilliant idea, but he's now since changed that brilliant idea to an even more brilliant one, Jack, where it would be us buying nuclear subs from the French, essentially off the shelf. All right. The Robodebt RC has wound up and will be awaiting its report. Rick Morton.
I don't know whether you've been following this, but I have. It's a brilliant piece of journalism, just following him on Twitter with this. I refuse to buy the Saturday paper. It's the only time, though, I've ever followed court reporting that's interspersed with descriptions of him hanging out his washing at his mum's place in the middle of Queensland. And indeed, with telling you how much of the washing he's hung out, what proportion he's hung out with mathematical certainty.
It's been very, very good. In fact, the Royal Commissioner actually applauded social media users and said that basically the mainstream media had largely ignored the hearings. And there wasn't, to be fair, there wasn't much reporting on it at all. So really those of us who either wanted to could watch the live proceedings, and I did on a number of occasions, or we followed Rick Morton, or there was another fellow called The Stranger on Twitter. He was very good too. And that led to the Royal Commission, the Royal Commissioner receiving or congratulating those people for doing just that.
Yeah.
Because it's quite serious, isn't it? I mean, this is a very serious matter, and not least of all the waste of money, but the human cost of all of this. And really, the performance from the head of the department was just unbelievable.
It gave us it's given us a rare opportunity to have a look under the bonnet, so to speak, of exactly how our bureaucracy is working, and the answer is not very well. Okay.
So what would your understanding be? What about these? What about the careers of these people? Surely they don't have any career prospects now in the public service anymore. Certainly on the Commonwealth dime.
Well, I think they vary. Some people have sort of come out of it okay, and some very badly.
Well, none more so than the head of the department, who just her evidence was absolutely staggering.
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll await the report.
At least surprising, put it that way.
Well, I mean, it was watching her give evidence was like watching someone who'd become completely detached from reality, and any factual basis that was brought to it. I mean, it was laborious, absolutely, just laborious watching it. And of course, Along the line there, Jack, there's a nice little quote here from Councillor Assisting Gregory at KC, who quizzed someone who actually made who had basically had the temerity to challenge the robo-debt claim, Jack. And he said, "How do you feel about the idea of being a test case against the Commonwealth government?" And this fellow, I think it was a woman actually, wasn't it? Marta.
Yeah, it was a woman.
She says, "I was very scared. It gave me a bit of anxiety. It wasn't an easy decision, but seeing the documents for myself, it seemed really obvious where the mistake happened. And I just felt like it was in the right place. I was in the right place to do it because it was just so obvious." And what was so obvious, Gregory asked? It was averaged over the whole financial year. Study usually starts at the beginning of the calendar year. So I'd been working full-time for the first 6 months of that year. Then I stopped working full-time to study. So it was really obvious that they'd averaged out over the whole year rather than the 6 months I was actually only claiming I studied. Such an obvious thing. Ministers, bureaucrats, all just have been torn to shreds by this and they've sort of dusted themselves off and walked out smiling.
Well, I actually think that the bureaucracy's come off worse than the politicians in this.
Oh, there's no doubt about that. I mean, there was this, they deliberately kept legal advice from ministers, from the cabinet, that they had in their possession. And they did so because they were fearful that the head of the department might react badly. And in the end, what was the cost of it? $2 billion, $2 billion in compensation, all the money that they recovered returned. So it's a multi-billion-dollar failure. And we can go even further as to say the anxiety and stress that it caused people did in some cases lead to suicides and just a great amount of fear more generally. Terrible business, terrible business. Now, the Voice, Jack, they tell me, reading the Fin Review yesterday, that Dutton and Albanese are very close. But when I read Dennis Shanahan, the Australian today, I'm told that's not the case.
They're very close to agreeing on a procedure. And in fact, this morning, I think they've announced that they've agreed on a procedure to put the thing up in Parliament. But I don't think they're close on the substance at this stage.
Not close on the wording, yeah, that's right. So there seems to be, and it would seem to me that there's a bit of a divergence between the government's position and the advisory body's position on wording as well. So you might just want to explain that. And it gets to these very sort of complex legal matters, constitutional legal matters,
just
in regard to the role of the Voice and whether it not overseas, what role it plays in the decision-making of the executive.
That's the key thing. Is it going to have a capacity to advise the Parliament or capacity to advise the Parliament and the executive? And that's a sticking point. And then I think the government's going to have three choices, basically. They can dump the idea of constitutional recognition and just legislate for a voice to advise both the Parliament and the executive, and that will get through, I would think.
Well, we get through, but it'll be a major backstep.
Yeah. Or they can push back against the working group, the Indigenous working group, and say, the proposal that you put up, we don't think will succeed, and we need to amend it. That's choice number two. And choice number three, I think, is that they can say, well, we don't want to push back against the Indigenous working group, so we'll just go with whatever form of words you put up, and we'll just have to hope it gets up.
Right, those are the three choices, and it's well put, actually. I suspect the government's position is the second one, but it will take a great deal of subtle negotiations to get to that point, to a point where the advisory group and the government have a defined role of the Voice that they can both live with.
Yeah, something that's almost certainly winnable if they get that. If they get the wording right and they get the proposal right, I think the thing will succeed. But if they don't and they mess about with, I don't think it will succeed at all.
All right, long way to go there. But it would seem that we will see within the next fortnight, I would that we will see the question actually that will be put to the referendum.
Linda Burney says within this 2-week sitting period.
All right, Jack. Ugly scenes on Saturday outside the Victorian Parliament when a bunch of Nazis turned up and started zig-heiling from the steps of Parliament. We've all heard the stories. There was an anti-trans group had assembled there to protest. There was a responding trans rights group. There was a bit of argy-bargy between the two. The police were keeping them at bay. I think a number of arrests were made, and then the Nazis turned up. Now, the big thing for us from a political...
I would just say that I wouldn't classify it as an anti-trans group. I would classify it as a pro-women's spaces group.
Well, it's hard to know, Jack. I mean, Polly Parker's got a long history of being, anti-trans. I mean, that's clearly it. I mean, this really does get to this point of why Nazis turned up, because she's got a bit of a history of using, shall we say, language that is pulling at the shirt tails of Nazism. So the political aspect is the thing I'm really interested in here. Maura Deeming was present there. I believe she spoke.
She's a Liberal MP.
She's a member of the Legislative Council in Victoria. She represents the Western Metropolitan Region. She was chosen after her predecessor, Bernie Finn, was expelled from the Liberal Party under Matthew Guy's leadership. Now it seems that John Pizzotto, the leader of the Victorian Liberal Party, parliamentary party opposition, is seeking to have her expelled from the party as well.
For being present at this demonstration on Sunday.
For being present at the time, look, there are a couple of things there, Jack. I really need to inform you about that. Deeming after one of the organisers. That's not Deeming. We'll be very careful about this. Angie Jones, who's actually from the left, she said, "Women on Twitter. This is before the march. Women and Nazis are fighting for the rights of women. Are you?" That was her tweet. So that indicates to me that there was a knowledge amongst some of the organisers that this was going to happen. The second thing is Deeming, Catherine Devis, Polly Parker, and one other woman who I couldn't identify were on a sort of Facebook Live after the protest, sipping champagne and saying that it wasn't Nazis, it was the Antifa or possibly police that had intervened in this rally. Later that night, Deeming issued a statement saying that she was unaware of these people turning up and she felt very frightened and intimidated. The point I would make, Jack, is that none of them left. I mean, either you get the Nazis to leave or you leave. I think that's the way you've got to handle that sort of thing. But none of them did.
So do you think she should be expelled from the party?
Well, I think she will be expelled from the party now.
I actually don't think she will, I say.
John Ferguson in The Australian yesterday the very strong indication that Pizzotto has the numbers to remove her now. If he doesn't, I think there are serious problems for Pizzotto and there are very serious problems for the Liberal Party going forward.
Yeah.
One thing that Ferguson, just before you go on, one thing that Ferg did say, which I thought was absolutely right, is that when you become a parliamentarian, as Deeming has been now for less than 6 months, you don't really look. She's made two speeches, two profoundly anti-abortion speeches, including her first speech to the upper house. You don't rush at these things like a bull at a gate, otherwise you are going to come a cropper. And I think that's kind of what's happened here. If Ferg says that Pizzotto's got the numbers, then I'd be pretty I'd be pretty comfortable that he's right.
He may well have the numbers. I'm just not sure what she's getting expelled for.
Okay, well, let's start with the basic one, what I just mentioned before. Nazis turn up. Nazis are basically interacting with this protest group, including with Maura Deeming. Then there's the sinkhole salutes and so forth. As I said, you either ask them to leave, and if they won't leave, you leave. I think that's the way you've got to handle Nazi presence at a rally.
Yeah, well, I think that's a new test for mine.
Well, how does it look if you stay there? If you stay there, communicating with them.
Well, if she was being expelled for being pro-Nazi, I could sort of see it, but I just don't see the evidence for that at the moment. Anyway, we'll see how it pans out.
No, well, we will see. We will see how it pans out. It's a real test for the Liberal Party. Look, this is my final word on this. What this really does expose is just this the paucity of any sort of intellectual or ideological sense within the Victorian Liberal Party at the moment. That this is a party populated by extremists who are step by step becoming unelectable, with people like Pizzato, the moderates, being drawn into the minority within their own parliamentary party. How would most Victorians feel about this? And most Victorians are going to feel about this as, what the hell is the Victorian Liberal Party up to now?
I think you've got to go more than just thinking about what the most Victorians will think about it and get this right. I would have thought John Pizzuto would have the wit to say that he's opposed to Nazis and all that they stand for, and he might not agree with...
Well, who is? I think that's the point,
Just
Jack.
let me finish. He might not agree with the pro-women's spaces view, but that's a view that's perfectly entitled to be made.
It is perfectly entitled to be made, but...
And that's what he didn't say. That's what he should have said.
Any political leader who comes out and says, I am opposed to Nazis, is really stating what should be patently obvious.
No, sometimes you've got to say these things out loud.
No, I think enough has been said, Jack, for you to come out and say, look, we don't like Nazis. I mean, the optics of this is absolutely terrible. They're terrible for Devis. They're terrible for Deeming. Polly Parker has got a history there where you should have a look at a Glasgow rally where she talked about the big lie, which was a phrase much used by the Nazis in regard to the Holocaust. She's been, she denies it. Everyone denies it. I mean, these guys don't get around in swastikas and brown shirts anymore. But the simple fact of the matter is they turned up, and the members, including the organisers of that rally, who are perfectly, as you say, perfectly entitled to be expressing their opinions, stayed exactly where they were with the Nazis.
Okay. Well, I get your point. I just don't think she should be expelled unless there's some evidence linking her to the Nazis beyond being in the same geographic location.
Now, Jack, quick trivia question. She'll be in the, let's presume she's expelled. Let's just get ahead of that and just say that it happens. But she will be in the upper house for 4 years or 3.5 more years. Is that right?
I think that's correct, yeah.
New South Wales, it's 8 years. Jesus Christ. And you only need 4% of the vote, Jack. Why don't we have a crack? You don't have to do anything. You're a member of the upper house, as if you have to go to school fetes or do anything like that.
A political pal of mine, she and I used to joke about the ideal job for a politician would be to be in the Tasmanian upper house.
Oh, yeah. That's rich. There's only about 12 of them too. There's barely a cricket team.
Because Tasmania, of course, gets 5 House of Rep seats because that's the minimum number a state can get. That's in the federal sphere. Yeah. It gets the 12 senators. 12. Plus all of the local politicians, the local members. They have what do they call it? A good friend of ours used to call it the hair lip system to determine their local state MPs.
That's very rude.
And so by the time that your constituent wants to bother a politician, they've got about 50 people to get to before they bother someone in the state upper house.
There's also the small matter of per capita representation.
Yeah, and it's about as big as a Geelong and a half, I think, Tasmania, isn't it, population-wise?
You literally, you basically got one person. So about three people electing one person. Very
So you
similar
can
to
be
the
a politician without having to deal with pesky constituents wanting you to fix the road or anything like that.
Well, what about local government, Tasmania, Jack? We've still got councils here too, Anyway, the banks. Where are we now with the banks? Is it time to go down to the bank and demand your cash and refuse the office furniture?
Well, I don't think we really know how bad the situation is. And the reason I say that is that nobody from the outside can tell just how bad the bank's positions on these various problems are. And the problem is what the 2008 global financial crisis tells us is that even within the banks, they don't know necessarily how bad their position is.
Okay, so what's the driving force here, Jack? I mean, the Credit Suisse we can not apply this the policies of Trump to Credit Suisse, but SVP we might be able to. There was one of the criticisms last year that the prudential requirements were dropped on some of the small banks, on banks with savings holdings under, I think, 50 billion. Was it 50 billion?
Yeah.
But that seems to be a bit of a red herring, doesn't it?
It's nothing to do with it at all. What's knocked over at the SVB Bank was that they had invested in AAA gilt, blue ribbon, long-term bonds, which have dropped in present value. If you try and cash them in today, their values drop considerably because the inflation rate's so high.
Yeah, that seems to be the problem. So this is one of the problems of sustained high inflation, that your banks will come under a bit of pressure. It must be said that the Australian banks' prudential requirements, basically of a sort of gold standard, and there is nothing really to be worried about in terms of it's where you have an essentially deregulated environment like the United States, where you have big, small, even town-sized banks that you can have real problems.
Yeah, I think that's right. No one really knows how many more banks are at risk, as I say, because I suspect that they don't either. If you'd watched the farewell press conference for the chairman of Credit Suisse, you might have come to the conclusion that the reason they got into trouble was pretty badly run.
That seems to be the case with Credit Suisse, doesn't it? That they sold a multi-billion. They've basically been sold for an absolute fire sale price. Place was worth about 80 billion not so long back, and they sold it for 4.
And they had to move quickly because I think there were 10 billion worth of deposits were taken out on the last day.
Ouch!
So that was going to be an absolute disaster.
Now, Jack, let me just spring this on you. We didn't. I should have mentioned this to you before, but we have seen some biological information around the source of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, Jack, pointing to zoonotic transmission that has involved an animal I didn't even know existed until very, very recently, called a raccoon dog, which is a sort of raccoon-faced fox. And I read in Scientific American there's fairly comprehensive evidence. We might not say that it was overwhelming, but according to the scientist that was interviewed, who's a biologist at the University of California, he said the only way the lab leak theory works now is if a person went from that lab, the Institute of Virology in Wuhan, to the Huanan market without infecting anybody, and then infecting 2 raccoon dogs, and then coming back to the Institute, the Wuhan Institute of Virology without infecting anybody.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to get into the arguments about the lab leaks or not. I live up here.
All right, fair enough. It just seems like it was kind of always what we were told. But anyway, one thing I guarantee you is it will always be contested.
Sorry?
It will always be contested.
Yeah, probably will be. Yeah.
On to energy now, Jack. Bans on washing machines, gas stoves, and what? What's going on there? There's no bans, are there? There's just they're
just raising the regulatory requirements of them to rule out about 90-something% of the existing ones.
They're not bans, so that's not a ban, is it? It's just
it's an
some
effective
efficiency
ban.
standards to white goods. We've had it for a very long time here, Jack. You'd have, I don't know about Hong Kong, but of course, virtually every white good in the house has got an efficiency sticker on it.
Yeah, and what they're talking about is raising those requirements to rule out 90+% of the current market, the current products.
All right. Now, of course, the other thing I am going to spring on you a little bit is that the IPCC report was released yesterday, because we're talking a little bit about energy now, Jack, and it was, and I guess we all get a bit used to this, it's sort of a bit apocryphal. It is their last report, I think, until 2035, or it might be 2030.
Did you say apocryphal or apocalyptic?
What did I say?
Apocryphal.
No, sorry, yes, I meant to say apocalyptic. We are sort of getting a bit used to the apocalyptic messaging. But of course, it is 700 climate scientists, Jack, and neither you nor I are one of those. And there is, I think, one of the sort of take-home things was that half the world's population now, Jack, do not have access to a reliable water supply, to a fresh water supply.
Do not have access to a reliable
water supply.
Yeah.
So when we talk about, and you have before, about electricity going into black and brown people in Asia and Africa and so forth, I mean, the first thing to note here is that basically reliable water supply is the first thing that the climate change is causing in those areas, in Africa and Asia.
Yeah,
that's where it's going to come.
The best comment I saw on the IPCC report this morning was on Twitter, and it goes like this. What I really love about apocalyptic climate warnings is that I get older and the warnings stay the same.
Well, where have they got it wrong? I mean, in their previous reports, where have they got it wrong?
Well, I don't know whether they got it right or wrong. What I'm saying is that the current media commentary on climate science is wrong. Certainly in Australia, the idea that gas is a stranded, that coal and gas are stranded assets is complete nonsense. We're going to be using coal and gas well beyond 2050. The world is.
Okay, so you've got some figures there from our world in data. Just go through those for us, please, mate.
Well, what it shows is that there's no energy transition. What the renewables are doing is adding to a growing energy market. And the reason
global consumption of energy is increasing.
Is increasing, and it's increasing far faster than the renewables input to that.
Right.
So what's happening is the demand for energy is going up, and the reason it's going up is that people in the third world want the benefits that we've had from cheap, reliable, dispatchable energy. And the only way we can prevent the energy demand around the world from going up is to say to poor black and brown and yellow people, you can't have what we got.
Well, I don't know that those are the only choices. I mean, we are starting to see a big renewables come in big ways throughout the world. So really what we're looking at is part of a shift, aren't we? Aren't we looking at a part of a shift from the energy mix? Because I guarantee you those figures, if you looked at them 20 years ago, renewables wouldn't be adopting them.
There's been a diminishment of use of things like coal in the United States and Australia and places like that, but not worldwide, not at all. China is approving the building. Last year in 2022, China approved the building of basically one coal-fired power station per week.
All right, so if the IPCC's right, mate, we're in a bit of strife, aren't we?
We may well, if they're right, we may well be. But the idea that people are going to stop using coal because the IPCC says to is just wrong. They're not going to.
How are we going to fix it? How are we going to fix it, though? Surely there's a role for technology, Jack. There's a role for technology. Look, I understand once you build coal-fired power plants, you're not going to shut them down a week later or a month or a year later. But surely there's got to be a role for technology here.
Well, if there is a technological solution to this, it hasn't been found.
Right. And I'm looking at one of your graphs here, Jack, that renewables certainly renewables are growing and quite significantly. What is that? Renewables up there, and then hydroelectricity there. Then we've got coal. What's that one then? Oh, that's natural gas and oil. Well, oil production's... I just say the world price of oil has gone down. Not that that's particularly relevant. And so you're saying in emerging economies, China, India, etc.,
plus all of Africa,
plus most of Asia, that what we might call fossil fuels are being burnt to create electricity.
Yeah, exactly right. Not just to create electricity, to provide energy generally.
Yeah, to provide energy. Yeah. So that's where, if the IPCC reports and other climate scientists around the world are to be believed, this is where the problems lie. And surely you can't just walk blindly towards the cliff here, can you?
Well, then you're going to have to explain to the poor brown and yellow people why they're going to have to continue living in poverty.
Well, wouldn't there be an other solution, Jack, and say, well, look, here we go. Here is renewable technology here, and the good thing about it is once it's built, we don't have to shovel material into it to make it keep your lights on.
Because it can't be built quickly enough and reliably enough to fulfill what's required. The Chinese don't believe it, the Indians don't believe it, the Indonesians don't believe it.
All right, well, that's pretty grim stuff, Jack. Meanwhile, nuclear is to be classified as environmentally sustainable in the UK, Jack.
That's right, yes.
Well, would you like me to remind... I'll just remind our listeners of the UK's latest foray into throwing nuclear, broadening the contribution of nuclear energy into their grid. It was a decision made in 2006. I think they first turned the soil on it in around about 2011. And here we are in 2023. This is in Somerset, by the way, and it's still not up and running.
It is slow. But once you get it up and running, they'll last forever.
12 years, budget blowout. It cost $60 billion US dollars to build, and it's built by the French. That's the other thing, built by the French national company. $60 billion is a lot of money to provide. What I think it's 13% to the electricity grid in the UK.
Yeah, they're doing that to lessen their reliance on coal and gas.
Well, meanwhile, the French are reducing theirs from 70 to 50 in nuclear energy. I think we've discussed this. I think there's certainly a role for modular small reactors to provide electricity in, well, the ones that are being put around at the moment, there's one in China, which you probably wouldn't bother with too much. There's one that's been designed to be built in the United States. the capacity of them in kilowatts is they light up about 40,000 homes, or you could use them for heavy industry. They're not water intensive. That's one of the things that I think is a real benefit for them, because if you're looking at nuclear power in Australia, any large scale reactor, just you couldn't put it on the eastern seaboard where it needs to go, or if you're going to put it on the river systems, well, you'd have to understand that the river systems in Australia are pretty unreliable because
No,
of
put
climate
one on
change.
North Head, mate.
Well, yeah, put one in Warringah, Jack. Yeah. Look, not opposed to it, but the three things about any sort of energy policy is it's got to be cheap, it's got to be reliable, and it's got to be, low carbon emitting. I think those are the three requirements, and I'm not sure that nuclear energy ticks the first two boxes.
Yeah, well, I think a large part of the world don't agree with the third one of those, low carbon emitting. The Chinese certainly don't. The Indians don't. The Indonesians they're all building coal-fired power stations.
Yeah, okay. All right, well, let's move on to Russia and the Ukraine, Jack. And I'm going to ask you a question. Is Russia now a vassal state of China?
It's a little bit hard to know that for sure because there's a lack of transparency in their relationship.
Yes, I think that's reasonable to say.
I mean, certainly the Chinese have, I guess, a fair bit of influence. Let's be kind about this. On the eastern Russia, a lot of the agricultural land there is now being used by Chinese production.
Well, Vladivostok's Chinese, Jack. Russians pinched it.
There was a story the other day in the paper that some of the Chinese are promoting that its name before it became Vladivostok. It used to have a Chinese name.
Yes, indeed. Well, it was part of China and Russia,
which I've forgotten at the moment. But yes, so
it doesn't matter.
Who knows how that will pan out? I guess that in part that depends upon how Russia is going.
Yes. Well, Russia, we looked at their GDP figures late last year, Jack, and they are kind of in depression territory. I mean, sustained negative growth around 7 or 8% per annum. They are in all sorts of trouble, and they need powerful allies, and they certainly seem to have found one in China. Always have for obvious reasons, but the nature of that relationship, even if we're going back to the Cold War days, has very, very, very much changed. But Russia is now the inferior party.
They have a troubled history together, I think it's fair to say.
Yes, there hasn't always been a lot of goodwill. But this, and I understand, we need to be cautious about this, but it's clear that both countries have a profound anti-US stance, and that this is their way of presenting an anti-US face to the world.
Yeah, that might be a fair assessment.
All right. So where are we going? Look, where are we going in the Ukraine conflict, Jack? And it has been bogged down. We are now in the early spring in Ukraine, a time when there's a lot of permafrost melting or frost melting, grounds getting softer, which is not great for heavy machinery, heavy military equipment. Do you think that there'll be, the arrival of and I've been talking about this for a little while, the arrival of the Abrams tanks, I suggest will be a game changer, and where the Ukrainian troops have been bogged down in places like Bakhmut, they could quite easily be resolved. Abrams tanks, longer firing range, faster, more manoeuvrable, could bring some really big problems for the Russians there. Is it worthwhile looking at even the survey Here we go. The Times ran one, said the various options available. Ukraine must regain all of its territory, even if that means a longer war or more. Ukrainians being killed. Britain says 44%, Italy 26%, Germany 33%, France 35%, Romania 22% in favour of that eventuality. So, if we're looking at that, we want fairly swift breakthroughs. And at the same time, we've seen the Russian, the Wagner Group, having all sorts of problems there with their with making demands and being highly critical of the Russian military machine.
Yeah, that mightn't be. I might be getting onto AMP and having them cancel the Wagner Group head's life insurance there, because
he's a piece of work, Jack. He could do.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone would be too upset if someone popped a couple of.
He might find himself having a mysterious fall.
Yeah, it just seems that the sort of limits of the Kremlin's power is in that East Ukrainian battlefront there. I think we basically need to sit back just for a few months. We need to get into the European summer and see what the sorts of kit that NATO is providing, the Germans and the Americans in particular. I noticed too the Poles are providing a number of, I think only two, but airstrike capacity through fighter jets, and that's something the Americans won't really countenance, although they're sort of dabbling with it at the moment. But isn't that something else they should be doing, or is there fear of escalation?
Don't know. I must say that I'm not as optimistic as a lot of the Ukrainian barrackers are in the West.
Well, what about there is now a warrant for the arrest of Vladimir Putin, Jack. Now, clearly that's a symbolic sort of effort. I keep coming back to the same issue. If you invade a country, if you bomb its cities, a neighbouring country, by the way, if you bomb its cities, if you kill its civilians, there's got to be a price to pay for that. And the price isn't going to be, we'll give you some of Ukraine's land and we'll forget about the war crimes.
I don't know how it's going to be, quite honest, but I'm not as optimistic as a lot of people in the West seem to be.
Well, Donald Trump reckons he'll have it knocked over in 24 hours, Jack, when he's elected president. How do you reckon he'd do that, by the way? We'll get on to Trump in a minute.
Idea.
How do you reckon he'd do that? And I saw some bloke interviewed, Trump had the American flag and eagles and all sorts of stuff all over him, and he was asked, well, how do you think that would happen? How do you think you would get rid of, how you'd be able to resolve this conflict in 24 hours? And the guy said, well, the guy was interviewed said, so land troops? He goes, no, so American land troops in the Ukraine. He goes, no, but the threat of it would be enough. The threat of it would be enough for the Russians to go, we better get running home.
Well, no, I keep reading the media, and I read stuff that says that, look, Russia's on the retreat, or they're definitely going to lose. I don't see the evidence for that yet. They may well end up happening, but I just don't have an optimistic view about it, as optimistic a view about it as a lot of the media commentators seem to be.
I reckon just let the Poles go, mate. The Poles just want to go to Moscow. They're raring to go.
Yep.
Let them off the leash, I say. Former President Donald Trump. Well, he's the only one who's predicted his arrest. He's the only one who's predicted he'll be indicted. And here we are on Wednesday afternoon. And really the time limit for the Tuesday arrest, which would be Wednesday our time, is pretty much past us, Jack. But he reckons he will be indicted.
Yeah, so he keeps saying.
That's what I'm wondering. Is it real? I mean, there seems to be no indication. He may well be indicted at some point, but Tuesday? I mean, he gave a specific day for his arrest. And it seems to me that he's sort of clawing for a bit of support. Surely not.
He could well be.
Do you want to explain the indictment, what it might look to be, what it might be about, Jack?
Oh, I think it's going to be about not the substance of him paying off some porn star or having some porn star paid off, but the manner in which it was done. So it's an argument about misuse of financial campaign finances, perhaps. It looks a pretty weak case, I've got to say.
Well, on my understanding of that, because it's basically two misdemeanors make a felony, right? And the likely, no, not likely, the maximum penalty for something like this would not be a jail term.
No.
So it doesn't look like he's going to be jailed. He's got. It may not even be indicted. He's the only one saying he's going to be. Then we've got the.
I don't think he will be, by the way.
Well, I'm just going to say, just let me go through. So the Australian ran an editorial yesterday that he's got basically four matters. There's the Georgia matter, there's the January 6th stuff, there's the. Well, I'll tell you what, there's another little sneaky thing that someone raised to me, that if he is indicted and arrested, he will be fingerprinted and he will be cheek swabbed, Jack. And there's another little possible scenario there for a woman who has been claiming that he raped her, and possible release of DNA there, which is all very intriguing. But look, there's four potential matters, and it may well be that he's under indictment for all four within the next 6 months. My point is, none of those things will prohibit him from running for president.
If he's indicted on four matters, that will boost his chances of getting the nomination and the presidency.
Well, that's the Elon Musk thing. But and this is what I was getting to. That's Elon Musk. I mean, if Elon Musk says it, it's probably not going to happen, given his record of late. But that's what I'm saying. So with these sorts of things, maybe there's two, maybe there's three, maybe there's four, maybe there's just one. But if he's entitled, it's not going to prevent him from running for president. So, in this rather long-winded way, my question is: will it enhance his prospects, or will it reduce them?
It'll enhance them, in my view.
Okay, so let me ask you why that would be.
Because at least amongst about 50% of the population, they will see that he's being treated differently to other politicians.
How do we get to 50% on that, mate?
I think about half the country will think that.
Yeah. Okay. So the first thing I'd say about now that I've asked you the question, obviously this is not going to have anything to do with voter recognition. I mean, everyone knows who Donald Trump is.
No?
So the normal rules of American politics have pretty much gone out the window before Trump's time. But normally you would say if you've been charged with a criminal offence, it's not going to augur all that well for you or come election day or come primary day. And I still think that rule will follow. And that's because I think Republicans can jump up and down about Trump and support him or not, and Democrats can do the same. But in the middle, and a larger chunk of the third, so let's say 35% of the vote are independent voters, are going to look at this guy and go, we don't want any more of this. So I think it's an actual negative.
I think they don't want any more of Trump, but they won't like seeing him being charged with offences. They will see that he has been treated differently to other politicians.
Well, I think you'd find if you polled Americans, more than 50% would think he's a crook anyway.
That they may well think that, but they still won't want him treated differently to other politicians.
How would they see him being treated differently? This is called comeuppance. This is called it's about time. I mean, I went through a whole lot of stuff. I went through a whole lot of stuff on social media about all of this, and I tried as best I could to separate the Democrats from the Republicans. And generally speaking, when you got any sort of apolitical opinion, it's about time this guy got his collar felt.
Yeah, absent him being charged, I don't think he'll be the candidate.
Yeah, it's actually put a bit of pressure on DeSantis to do something about it, or to say something about it.
He has this morning. He's done an interview with Piers Morgan, which is sort of a campaign launch, I think.
Yeah, I mean, so where does that? Okay, let's go further with that and speculate. And say, okay, so DeSantis wins the primary, and at some point along the line, Donald Trump gets nailed. Falls off the branch. What happens to Donald Trump?
Oh, I don't know. He probably wanders off and plays golf.
But he does it now.
I don't think he'll be a third-party candidate. I don't think he'll do that.
Oh, okay, I don't think that's likely either. We've been saying for some time
he won't want to lose.
No, it's not going to be good for his mental health. I think we can say that. But we have been saying for some time that, and you and I sort of agree that we doubt that it'll be Biden v. Trump again. But then there's a whole mass of polling that indicates that it will be. So yeah, it's sort of back in play.
Interestingly, the Trump support in Iowa, which is the first of the Republican primary caucuses, Republican primary votes, the Trump support has dropped 20 points in the last month or so.
Is that right? Yeah. And look, I hate to say, but I think it's just one of those things. You can't be charged with criminal offences and expect it to be a boost for your political fortunes. That's my view. Anyway, Jack, in last week's episode, you described South Africa as a gangster. Was it a gangster state? Becoming a gangster state without wanting to misquote you?
Veering in that direction, put it that way.
Veering in that direction, and there's a bit of evidence that's come our way that might suggest that you're right.
Yeah, there was a chap there who's he's an accountant, really, but he was investigating government corruption scandals, and he and his son were shot dead in Pretoria.
Well, that's, to be fair, another day in South Africa. But what's the particular? He
was investigating a government corruption that goes to the highest levels of the government in some scandals there.
So this is the company Bosasa. He was a liquidator. That's a company, but he has worked as a liquidator for firms linked to the wealthy Gupta brothers, who deny bribery accusations. Police will see if there is a link. Mr. Murray was shot by unknown gunmen. One of those companies was Bosasa, a government contractor specialising in prison services. Oh, don't you just love it when prisons get privatised, Jack? That's always a good idea. The landmark Zondo Commission into Corruption concluded the company extensively bribed politicians and government officials to get government contracts during the 9-year presidency of Jacob Zuma, who, if he isn't a crook, Jack, he'd do a pretty good impersonation of one.
Oh, you're just going off on him because he couldn't find a few $1 million tucked behind his casket.
But there was quite a little amount. It wasn't quite as much as that. Mr. Zuma, of course, refused to cooperate. We've talked about the problems in South Africa. Major problems around energy, routine brownouts in the big cities. It just looks like an absolute basket case developing, Jack.
And there's going to be a nationwide marches and strikes about the power crisis. Right. And the president and the police commissioner are characterising those protests as an attempt to overthrow the government.
Overthrow the government. This is not a shutdown, but it's anarchy, said the KwaZulu-Natal Police Commissioner, Lieutenant General now. Well, I won't even try and pronounce his first name, but Makwanasi is his surname. And the opposition party, just for those curious, is called the Economic Freedom Fighters. But basically, South Africa is, as we know, a sort of one-party state with the ANC
which is the source of a lot of their problems. The fact that it's become a one-party state.
That's it. It just doesn't work, does it? And it just means that the people in government just get lazy and are prone to corruption because there's no electoral threat.
That's correct.
And while you've got a one-party state in, you're not going to have any sort of reasonable examination of corruption. Meanwhile, in Nigeria, Jack, the last we reported on it was they'd gone to the election and it was very, very unclear. So where are we now as to what's
the
happening
ruling
with the
party
election?
candidate seems to have won, and they're gone to the next step, which is regional elections. So they're taking place. So a bit to play out left yet there, but it looks like the ruling party is going to continue in power.
Going to continue in power. Well, it's again, you've got a real problem there too, because there are massive problems going in across Africa, but Nigeria is perhaps one of the most benighted countries in the continent. Now, Jack, how do you watch your footy?
I was just going to ask you, do you get nervous watching Carlton play?
I get worse as I get older. I actually, I will watch. I know a couple of people who are too nervous to actually watch a game live, but I will watch. I've been consigned to the bedroom upstairs. I'm not allowed to watch it on the main television downstairs because I get a bit noisy. So I'm consigned to the bedroom where I literally sit on the edge of the bed and watch the game and sort of sweat it out like that. It's I got to say, it's a little bit pathetic.
Yeah, I got a pal, Big John, his name is, an Aussie fellow. He used to live in here in Hong Kong. Great Geelong man. He's safely back in Ballarat these days. But whenever it got close during those years, 2007, 2009, 2011, whenever it was close in the last quarter, he'd leave the pub and go out and stand at the front with the smokers because he couldn't bear to watch it.
Couldn't bear to watch it.
And we'd send him a text and saying it's safe to come back in now. So last year, grand final day, we were WhatsApping each other because it's the Swans and the Cats, and wishing each other good luck for a good afternoon, etc., etc. And about halfway through the third quarter, I sent him a text, mate, so you can come inside now.
It's all over quarter time, to be honest. Yeah.
And but even halfway through the third quarter, he said to me, "No, it's too close."
It's a bit too close. And another Geelong Barrago. And Geelong have been probably the most successful side, perhaps with Hawthorn over the last 20 years. And he'll go for long walks. He won't watch it live. And another mate of mine, a good mate of mine, Brian. Well, he'll put the jumper on. He'll put the Richmond jumper.
This is your Richmond mate.
He'll put the just watching in the lounge. He's not going to the footy. Pops the jumper on. And at half time, if they're looking to be in any trouble, they'll go and put the shorts and the socks on.
Yeah.
And he's 50. Well, he'll be 50, 58. Should know better.
Yeah, I can remember back to the 1984 grand final. We were in the outer watching Essendon, and after the debacle of the previous year, and a couple of the guys had to go outside, to go out the back for a smoke because they couldn't bear to watch until Essendon got the run on. It happens.
It does happen. It's a bit sad, really. Carlton play the Cats this week. Geelong well beaten by Collingwood.
There is that fabulous story, though, of I think when David Parkin was coach about I think I might have said to you, you need to have the earphones in, listening to the music like the players do before the game. And it's that fabulous old story of David Parkin walking in, I think it must have been before the 81 or 82 grand finals, and he found all of his players were lying on their backs on the floor. What was his name? Rudy Webster, that West Indian fellow who was the
bit of
motivator.
Meditation, bit of visualisation, all that sort of stuff.
And I remember watching an interview when David Parkin said that, and I just had this picture of what on earth would Val Perovic and Sellers McClure and Jimmy Buckley be doing flat on their back meditating? I mean, it's like I can sort of understand why they'd be flat on their back after a big night on the squirt the night before.
Surely not before
but
a
not
grand final,
meditating.
Jack. Surely not before a grand final. But those were the days when the Carlton side played hard off the field and played on it. They play the Cats this week. Cats well beaten by Collingwood, who do look very good. There was some early talk, algorithms and all this sort of nonsense that Collingwood were going to drop back to the pack after having a season last year where they won a lot of games by very small margins. Well, they didn't win Friday night's game by a small margin. They won it by a big margin over the reigning premiers, and they look very, very good.
They did look good, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. Early days, of course.
Our friend Grant will be booking his tickets for Melbourne for September, I think.
They do get carried away, don't they? Richmond and Carlton, of course, first game, a fairly disappointing draw. I think probably both sides will be disappointed with that. Both sides have, great forward assets, and it was a very low-scoring game. I really enjoyed North Melbourne's win over West Coast Eagles. 35 degrees outside on the Saturday afternoon outside Docklands, and they had the roofs cut, so they reckon it was about 45 inside. And North got the chocolates under their new coach, Alistair Clarkson. It was a good sign, because what you see with a lot of sides who've been coached in particular ways with a new coach is that game plan can just degenerate or disintegrate under a bit of pressure, but they hung in there.
That's a thing with new coaches and new game plans. They tend to start games well, but they find that, as they get tired and the pressure goes on, they revert to their old habits and forget the new game plan.
Indeed. Look, I actually watched the replay of the ODI. You weren't terribly excited about it, but the ODI series, and I think it's only 3 games. I may be wrong, but
I think there's one more tonight, isn't there?
Yeah, there's one tonight, and so there's definitely 3, but I don't think it's a best of 5. I think it's a best of 3. India won the first game. Some very good performances from Stark and Mitch Marsh in that first game. And then the second game came along, and we were just reminded just how good a player Mitchell Stark is. The Indians were, I think, the Shubman Gill was out early to a bad shot to Stark. But they were one with Kohli and Sharma batting. They were 1 for 30 off about 4 overs, and looked like they were just cruising. And then Stark just went bang, 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 bang. And by the end of his first spell, which I think was 5, maybe 6 overs, he had sort of 4 for 28. The ball wasn't doing a whole lot, Jack. The ball wasn't it was swinging a little. There was nothing sideways off the deck, and the game played in the eastern part of India. It might have been a bit humid, but there wasn't exaggerated amount of swing. He just, when he gets it on the spot and just does a little bit with it, it becomes almost unplayable.
I couldn't believe it when I walked into the pub to catch a bit of it on the telly, and I had a look at the pitch. It looked like the Gabba.
It did, except to say, it was a straw-coloured, good covering of grass. Was scuffing up a bit, even just with 1 day's play. But it really, you could look at Stark's figures. It's the 9th time he's got a 5 for in an ODI for a start, which is extraordinary. You could look at his figures and say the conditions suited him. I'd suggest that the conditions in Mumbai in the first game suited him more. But he Mitchell Johnson was commentating, who's a reasonable left-arm bowler himself in his day, and he was saying, he's just not quite there, and he's just got to get his lengths right, because Kohli and Sharma were giving him a little bit of tap. and then he went bang Sharma. Then the new bloke came in, Sivanakumar came in. He's got him now 2 first ball globes, both same left, just stunk in front of the wickets. And then he just went on. Very good effort. And then Mitchell Marsh, Jack, I don't reckon I've seen a bloke hit the ball cleaner and harder than him. He just really gives it a tap. When he's hitting the ball straight, he just looks sensational. Pulls the ball well. He's been in fantastic form for Western Australia. We probably haven't seen nearly enough of his good cricket at Test level. But as a white ball player, he is a sensation.
I suspect we won't see him at Test level now. I think Cameron Green's got that spot.
I think those days have passed. Of course, his brother Sean just retired from a very, very long international and national career, and pretty good one at that too. And of course, we did see the Smith catch, which is probably one of the best. That was off the bowling of the New South Wales medium pacer, Sean Abbott. Brilliant full length dive, left-handed catch. Did you see it?
Can we just pause for a moment?
Sure. Yeah, look, it was just a wonderful catch. Did you see it?
Yeah, it did. Yeah.
Just a wonderful catch. He's a great fieldsman. He's probably put a couple down that he would hate in the last 6 months. All cricketers put down catches.
He was just going through a rough patch there in the early Test matches. I thought this series.
He took some rippers too.
He's a great cricketer.
At the same time, yeah. And look, they only chased 100. I think 117 in the second ODI, and
11 overs, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think they got him in 10. Yeah, Mitchell Marsh and Travis Head. It does raise the question, Jack. I know it's white ball, different from red ball, but Travis Head, I can't. I've just got to. I've got to see him as the opener for Australia. As Khawaja is fit, and he's only just got a calf, got plenty of time to get over it. You would imagine be the opener in the Ashes and the Test Championship. So where does that leave Dave Warner?
I think that Father Time might have caught up with him.
I think you might be right. We will see. Now, in the rugby league, Jack, have you been watching much of the league at all? We've seen the Dolphins. I think the Dolphins play the Broncos this week, Jack, and the Dolphins are going pretty well.
I see a little bit of the highlights. We don't get much of it on the telly up here anymore.
Yeah, Dolphins will play off in the new Derby. I don't know, Queenslanders are going to have to get their heads around all of that. Rabbitohs play Manly on the Saturday night. Storm, Tigers on Friday night at home. Storm, you'd reckon, would go pretty well there. And, of course, they're playing Thursday footy like they are in the AFL. And the Eels will play the Panthers, in which should be a very, very fine game. But, yes, that's the one to watch, the Dolphins v. the Broncos. And where are they playing? Oh, they're playing that at Suncorp. Yeah, so that will be one to watch. Bit of history there.
Indeed.
We do have some readers' letters, which I just wanted to draw attention to. They weren't super contentious, but listener Catherine, she just dropped me a line saying, going back a few episodes when we talked about school closures, and you're all opposed to it. School closures were, among other things you mentioned, says Catherine, about social distancing, both at school and getting to school. Shops could trade, but they could limit customer numbers. Not as easy to do in schools. This was part of the USA pandemic modelling and planning under Bush and Obama. Quick comment from you, Jack. We are doing a bit of review mirror stuff, aren't we, there, when we get to school closures, yeah. Certainly in that 2020 period. And, of course, Ray, who loves the show, Jack, Ray, you'd know him as Baseman. He wrote me a bit of an email saying, going back 2 weeks ago, you'd posed a question to me from an American mate of yours about China, about Donald Trump's gifts in foreign policy vis-a-vis China. And Baseman just wrote me an email saying he just loved the biff. Bring back the biff, he said. Now,
We do our best.
Yeah, we are doing our best. Look, and just to take us out, Jack, what has caught your eye this week?
Oh, the best thing on Twitter this week was from the wonderful Titania McGrath, the intersectional poet, she calls herself. Dog owners, stop saying good boy and good girl to your pets. This kind of gendered language is normalising the myth of canine sexual dimorphism and delegitimise the lived experience of trans dogs. Now, most importantly, have you ever seen The View?
No. I don't even know what it is.
No,
look, I know what you mean. Panel show in America, yeah?
Yeah. It's an all-women panel show.
Yeah.
And one of their number, Anna Navarro, who's meant to be a sort of Republican, I think, she was saying, Fox News every single day goes after Kamala Harris, trying to portray her as an inept and some kind of bumbling fool. She's not. They've got to stop playing into the hands of those people who cannot stand that she is the first woman of colour vice president. Now, I know that you work for the same people who run Fox News, Mr. Murdoch, and if they're running a campaign to make Kamala Harris look like some kind of bumbling fool, I want you to have a chat to Rupert when he rings to tell you what to write in your next column. And say,
tomorrow morning.
I've got a mate, Hong Kong Jack. He will run that program for you to make Kamala Harris look like a bumbling fool, and for a very reasonable fee. He's not a hard man.
Look, I think what you're saying is it's not that hard to do, Jack. You basically
I think I could do it from here in Hong Kong.
I think you just have to put a camera on her and wait for her to make a public utterance, and that's it.
And just one final thing before we go. It's from Finland. The University of Helsinki will confer an honorary doctorate in theology on the Swedish truant, Greta Thunberg, which just goes to show you the climate stuff is a religion.
Well, she did miss out on a lot of education, Jack, so it's a good thing. All right, thank you. Well, we're just going to have to wrap up there, and your hard thoughts on climate change and energy policy, but there's a bit of reality about what you say there in terms of consumption. I think that's been a bit of an eye opener for me. I want to thank you for your thoughts today, Jack. Also, we just want to remind our listeners that if you want to get in touch with us, we would love to hear from you. You can drop me a line on the Conditional Release Program at gmail.com, or indeed you can hit me up on Twitter on my DMs. And Jack, how do we get hold of you?
Find me on Substack. Hong Kong Jack, it's on Substack. You'll find me.
Hong Kong Jack on Substack. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for listening with us, listeners, and we'll join you next week. See ya.
Cheers.